Coming up today, an active granddad working in the garage and around the house learns he needs a new heart. How doctors discovered a rare disease and gave him more time with his family. Good morning. I'm Jessica Lovell. Welcome to the Morning Medical Update. Doctors were keeping tabs on Gene Taylor after a cancer diagnosis, but it was a different disease that was slowly killing his heart. Janine Kiesling shows us what it took to save his life.
Thank you.
Smiles and laughter filled Gene and Debbie Taylor's home when granddaughter Isabella visits.
Very energetic, she
Yes.
This rambunctious 3-year-old keeps the Taylors busy, and that's exactly how Gene prefers it.
He's always been energetic and wanted to do something. Because look at this house. He built it. So concrete work, everything, plumbing, wiring.
Even a 2017 bone marrow cancer diagnosis couldn't keep Gene down.
Every 3-4 months we'd do bone marrow and blood tests and just kind of keep an eye on it, and everything was pretty good.
But things took a turn in late 2020. His oncology doctors at the University of Kansas Cancer Center sent him to heart specialists at the University of Kansas Health System.
He was just about to walk me out the door with a clean bill of health, and then he got to reading through my chart and asked me a few silly questions, and then he said he wanted to do another test on me, and it came back that I had amyloid of the heart.
AL amyloidosis can affect the heart, causing it to become thick, stiff, and weak. Gene learned his heart was failing. Even worse, because he had active cancer, Gene was not eligible for a heart transplant. For the next 2 years, he would undergo chemotherapy with his failing heart. It was grueling. The once active Gene spent most days in bed. Finally, in November of 2022, Gene and Debbie got the news they'd been praying for. His body's positive response to the cancer treatment meant doctors could move forward with a heart transplant.
I'm very thankful for that place, because I honestly don't think, without some of the doctors, I don't think I'd be here.
The doctors and nurses and everyone at KU are just phenomenal.
Within days of the news, there was a new heart beating in Gene's chest, giving him his life back and giving his family their husband, father, and grandfather back.
That's what life's about. Family and friends, and enjoy yourself.
And we are so thrilled that Gene is able to spend more time with his family. Today, we are talking with 2 cardiologists involved in that transplant process that Gene had, and both specialize in heart failure and transplants. Andrea Vidic is Director of Heart Transplant Program here at the University of Kansas Health System. Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you. Yeah. Also joining us remotely today is Dr. Zubair Shaw. He is Director of the Amyloid Program here at the Health System. Dr. Shaw, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
I am great. Good to have you. So, Dr. Vidic, let's start with you. What is it like to know that Gene is it's really why you do what you do? He's getting more time with his family.
I mean, it's an amazing feeling, especially as our program has evolved to give opportunity to Gene and patients like Gene, because just a few years ago, Gene Taylor would not be a candidate at our center. We would send him to maybe a few centers in the country that would be able to offer heart transplantation to Gene. In this situation, it was actually very rewarding to work with Dr. Zubair Shaw, and as his cancer was getting close to remission, discussion in our multidisciplinary team, how can we transplant Gene Taylor? And almost everyone on our team said we should do it. We can do it because how our program has evolved.
So it's, the idea is to get him healthy enough to be able to be transplanted, correct? And to make sure he can take this.
Yes.
So I want to bring in Dr. Shaw because you're head of the amyloid program. Just help us understand the disease that Gene had. He has AL amyloidosis. It's not cancer, but it can show up alongside cancer. It's a problem that starts in the bone marrow?
Yes, in layman's term, amyloidosis means protein buildup, and protein buildup where it should not build up. It can be part of an organ, whole organ, or multiple organs. And there are so many proteins that can cause amyloidosis. So in Gene's case, the protein was coming from the bone marrow because bone marrow was cancerous. And unfortunately, he was following with outside oncology, and they were just focusing on the bone marrow and not taking into account this could affect his heart. And that's when he came to us, followed with us, and we looked into his heart. So it's rare, but AL amyloidosis is where bone marrow is abnormal, and then light chains, the products from bone marrow can, when bone marrow is dysfunctional, cancerous, can start building up on the heart. So that's AL amyloidosis of the heart.
Dr. Shaw, you should have told me that. Protein buildup is so much easier for me to say than AL amyloidosis. But I'm going to give it a shot today. Tell us about the program, though. I mean, this goes to show just how narrowly focused different areas of our heart transplant program is, and our cardio program here at the health system. Just tell us about this center and who you're treating.
Okay, so Maggie, this is actually two questions. So first, amyloid program, we have one of the largest in the whole nation. In terms of volumes, I think we are third largest in the country. And we treat, as I said, these are different proteins that can cause amyloidosis, one common being TTR or transthyretin. We have done, I think, 5 transplants in those patients, and maybe one of the leaders last year in the number of transplants done in those patients. Similarly, we have very robust AL amyloid center, and it's a joint venture between our cardiac amyloid program, as well as our cancer, our oncology colleagues. As you know, University of Kansas is now a comprehensive cancer center with huge expertise in amyloid. We have a dedicated amyloid specialist from oncological side, that is Dr. Ola Abdullah. And then a lot of times these amyloid patients, to get complete cure, at least chances of complete cure, would need bone marrow transplant. So again, we have one of the robust transplant teams, bone marrow transplant teams. And now to add to that component, we also offer transplant in these patients. So you need a very high functioning, highly trained heart transplant program also to provide full care for these patients. So to summarize, taking care of AL amyloid patients with a bone marrow cancer is very complicated, and to offer full treatment for these patients, you need a heart amyloid team, you need very experienced heart transplant team, you need a dedicated amyloid oncology team, and then you need a highly experienced bone marrow transplant team. So it's actually you need 5 specialties to provide full care of AL amyloid patients, and fortunately we have it.
And we have it, and we always say they're kind of down the hall, so to speak, where you can all be talking to each other. Dr. Vidic, kind of add into that about your position on this team.
So when Zubair, Dr. Shaw came to us and said, we want to do this, I said, well, let's meet with our oncologist. So actually we had a meeting with, Dr. Shaw arranged meeting with Dr. McGurk and Abdallah and their whole bone marrow transplant team. And we had multiple meetings, how we're going to do it, when are we going to proceed with heart transplantation, when are we going to resume chemotherapy after heart transplantation, will we need a bone marrow transplant afterwards? And there's a lot of communication. And Dr. Abdallah was kind enough to join actually our team during our selection to be even approved Gene for heart transplant. And his expertise helped us make decision. And we all bring a little bit of different knowledge, but at the end of the day, we make a decision as a team to make sure a patient goes from point A to point B. And it's a pleasure to see Gene doing so well, 6 months later, after what we would not have offered him just a couple of years.
A lot of high-level smart people in that room talking it out. I love to hear that. So let's talk more about patients like Gene. So I want to talk about how it's diagnosed, first of all, and then just like what symptoms somebody would present. Dr. Shaw, go ahead.
So diagnosing AL amyloidosis, as I said, is a multidisciplinary process. It starts with seeing an oncologist, where blood testing is done to see if there is any evidence of these protein products. We call them light chains in the blood, in the urine. And generally the next step is bone marrow biopsy. which was done in Gene's case, and no major abnormalities were found. And third step is to look at different organs, see if these proteins are building up. These tests, blood tests, bone marrow tests, can be normal, but patients can silently, we call it smoldering myeloma, smoldering amyloid, where they can still build it while there is no evidence in the blood, in the bone marrow. So next step would be to do biopsy of that organ. For example, in Gene's case, he was following with oncology actually outside. They were doing his blood test, bone marrow test regularly, and it looked kind of normal, not needing chemotherapy. It didn't look abnormal, but what they had not looked into was different organs. And we looked into heart, it kind of looked very thick. And I was suspicious, is he building up this protein from the bone marrow? So our next step was to do bone marrow biopsy, see why heart is thick. And unfortunately or fortunately, that did show that he was building this protein coming from bone marrow, and we diagnosed him with amyloidosis and immediately started chemotherapy to get him into remission. And after that, since he had it for years, he had kind of end-stage heart involvement. The next step generally is to control the cancer in the bone marrow, and then look for possibility of heart transplantation.
Let's move on to some show and tell, because Dr. Vidic, you brought some photos of Gene's old heart after it was removed. So I want to just point your attention over here. Is it coming? Is it coming? Is it coming? There it is. Okay. So this is what the heart looks like brought out. What is there anything unusual about it, or is it what you can't see?
Yeah. So this is hand of our transplant coordinators. Dr. Shaw runs a biorepository, so all majority of hearts, with permission of patients, get stored into biorepository. So they are all taken back to his lab, and basically this is shortly after heart was taken out by one of our surgeons.
Can I just say, though, that you and Dr. Shaw both said, oh, this picture isn't that big of a deal. And I'm like, no, we actually think these kind of pictures are a big deal. I know you see this every day, but just to see an organ outside the body is a big deal.
Yeah, and this is basically hand. Oh.
That was the hand. Okay. So now you dissect this heart. What are we seeing?
So this is heart basically cut longitudinally, and the orifice is supposed to be about 4.5 to 5 centimeters, which is about 2 inches. And you can see on this picture that orifice is less than ½ inch. And it's pretty impressive because how much protein has deposited, the heart has become so thick. And this is what basically Gene lived on for extended period of time.
And just give us a little bit of a biology lesson. What's all the red in there? What's all the red? Just so I know.
That's on the splattered.
Just the red meaty part.
Yeah. So this is basically part of the left ventricle cut through, and this is and this is basically kind of epicardium. This is endocardium, and you will this is how the heart is cut, and you can see a little bit of fat. Most of us have fat, but his heart is just enormous in comparison to most hearts we have, and it's instead of most heart failure patients, the heart gets bigger. This scar was just becoming thicker and thicker and thicker, and obliterating cavity, which basically we rely on to provide us cardiac output, what we call, or amount of blood the heart pumps with each beat, or with over 1 minute.
And over time, would that hole just completely close up?
Yes. Most of the time, this is what end stage basically heart kind of cavity gets completely obliterated, and unfortunately, patients cannot sustain output from the heart to maintain other organs, and the kidneys shut down, or even liver, because a lot of blood that's not being pumped forward. I mean, you get it back up into the liver, back up into the lungs, and that's why patients feel so poorly.
Okay, well, it makes sense, but it's always interesting to see what you're talking about and to see what Gene was feeling. Dr. Shaw, Gene needed a heart transplant, we know. He was also getting chemo at that time. So what needed to happen during or after the chemo to make him eligible for that transplant?
Yes. So, to transplant AL amyloid patients, it's very strategic, and it's kind of it's like a game of chess. Everything has to align. So when Gene came initially to us, he had active cancer in the bone marrow. So first step is to control that, what we technically call remission or even partial remission. And we knew his heart is end stage, as Dr. Vidic showed, and would not sustain too long. So time was of essence, but at the same time, you cannot do transplant when someone has active cancer. It will affect the new heart. So first step was aggressive chemotherapy while sustaining his heart wherever it was. So we referred him to our oncology team. Dr. Abdullah worked very hard with all the chemo options. I know he went through several options, didn't respond to one or had side effects to second, and ultimately we reached a point where his cancer was in partial remission. His protein levels were low, and we thought this was an opportunity to put a new heart in. Now, other question was, once he had gotten the transplant, he's in remission, will he be a candidate for bone marrow transplant? As I said, it's a three-pronged approach, and you need a bone marrow transplant program to do transplant in these patients so that they can get bone marrow transplant ultimately. So we involved our bone marrow transplant team, and they were on board and said, yes, we can offer bone marrow transplant after the heart transplant, depending on the timing and how he does. But after the transplant, the option was heart transplant. The option was either continuing chemo or doing bone marrow transplant. But so far after the transplant, as Gene did very good. His cancer is still in remission. He will ultimately need bone marrow transplant, which is very unique heart transplant, bone marrow transplant. Only few centers offer it. But we are again waiting for right time on him because cancer is in remission. He doesn't need anything right now.
Be sure to ask your questions. You can use the chat on YouTube, Facebook. You can tweet us or email us at the Medical News Network. That info is there on your screen. Let's get to our COVID count. Dr. Dana Hawkinson is out today, so we are happy to have one of his colleagues with us, Dr. Matt Shoemaker. He is the interim co-director of the Division of Infectious Diseases. And Dr. Shoemaker, I had to take a little double take. Where's your bow tie?
Good question.
I did a double take. You walked in, I was like, wait a second. Where's
So I guess, I don't know, I mean, like Dr. Stites was talking about yesterday, he switched his diet up and gained some weight. I guess my neck's getting too big to get
are you working out?
Yeah, we'll say that. I was working out, my neck got too big, so I couldn't get my shirt buttoned, so that's what it was.
I know, I'm just so used to you in those bow ties. Okay, bring them back one of these days. Okay, so let's get to our COVID count. What do the numbers look like?
Today we have a total, and this is active and recovering, of 27. We have 12 active. We have 5 in the ICU, and thankfully we have 0 on the ventilator.
Good. All right. We like the big goose egg is what we like to see there. So we're glad the numbers are staying low, but on the other hand, we know the number of people getting the bivalent booster vaccine, it's also low still. So we've heard Doc Hawk mention this before, but we want to hear in your words just why it's so important if people have not gotten that bivalent booster that they need to get it.
Well, we know with some of the circulating variants, the monovalent vaccine, the original vaccine, doesn't provide as good a protection. That's part of it. The other part is waning immunity. So after you get a vaccine or after you've had a natural infection, your antibody levels will drop, and so you just need to get that bivalent to get your protection back up. You know, and especially the patients that Dr. Shaw and Vidic are talking about, these types of patients very desperately need them because we know folks with heart disease and malignancy do worse with COVID.
Just get the vaccine. That's what you've been saying all along, right?
Yep.
Doc, thanks so much for coming by today. Come back and see us, okay?
You bet, anytime.
Okay. All right, well, this is cool stuff. The NFL Draft is putting the spotlight, of course, on Kansas City tonight, and the health system doctors who work with the team. They will be part of all of this action. We caught up with the head orthopedic surgeon for the Kansas City Chiefs. Dr. Paul Schreppel says that most of the offseason medical work was earlier during the combine in March, where doctors give full physicals to about 330 players. By now, the Chiefs have a plan for who they want in that draft. But as we know, plans can change.
It's not a static process. It's often very fluid, and the pick that you thought you may be making may turn out to be much different. So a lot of times there's some decision making that happens on the fly. So we're there in the war room or next to it to provide that medical component of that real time while they're trying to make those decisions.
Dr. Schreppel says they try to evaluate players on 2 big things. First, availability. Will nagging injuries keep them on the bench during the season? And then second, career longevity. How many years can they stay at the top of their game? So we'll be watching that. It's going to be a really exciting time here in Kansas City. Let's check if we have any reporters with us today. All right, let's get to our community questions. Okay, so first up is Randy. What happens to old diseased organs after a transplant? Will Gene's heart be studied, or patients like him, where do they go?
Zubair, you want to take that one since
Yeah,
you
as
have.
Dr. Vidic explained, so we do store all, we call them explanted hearts. It's a very methodical process. Samples are taken from each part of the heart. Heart still has right side, left side, and we keep them stored in what we call biorepository. There are several projects right now going on where look into gene expression, into why hearts fail with amyloidosis. Are there non-invasive treatment options we can do to prolong or slow it down? So in short, we store it, and we store them, and then are studying, especially gene profiling.
Another question is from Tim. How rare is AL amyloidosis? Can some doctors work an entire career and never see it in a patient?
It's not that rare. I would not call it a rare disease. It's the spectrum, though. AL amyloidosis, it's the spectrum. What Gene had is AL amyloidosis affecting the heart. That may be slightly rare, but overall AL amyloidosis, where cancer affects the bone marrow, and bone marrow is making more what we call light chains, or these protein fragments. That's not a rare cancer. It still is a common cancer, unfortunately.
Rachel wants to know, can AL amyloidosis affect other organs? And if so, which ones?
Yes, absolutely. So, once the bone marrow is cancerous, the cells that make antibodies are cancerous. Bone marrow starts to throw these antibody fragments into the blood, and they generally can build up on various organs. Various organs involved are kidneys are more common, heart, nerves, and sometimes our digestive system, our gut, liver occasionally. These are the most commonly affected organs, but kidneys and digestive system being the most common, followed by heart.
So Isabel wants to know, can you have AL amyloidosis and never end up needing a transplant? So like in Gene's case, perhaps, was a transplant inevitable for him?
So, Zubair, you want to take that one? Or?
Yes. So
it's off. So needing and getting are two different things, right? So, like we said, 2-3 years ago, we would not, even though he would need heart transplant, if he was in a situation, we would not offer it because those patients are most complicated type of patients, and most centers do not have expertise with bone marrow and heart, and heart amyloid program and heart transplant program and bone marrow transplant program and coordinators and everything else, because they require a lot of care. Because Gene can tell you that his post-op care was much more complicated than care of patients that we usually have after heart transplant who have idiopathic, non-ischemic, or who have heart disease due to blockages, and the heart becomes weak over time. So needing is probably much more frequent than what you're getting. So I think there are only a few centers, less than 10 in the country, who heart transplant programs who would even proceed with offering heart transplantation in somebody who has partial remission, because you have to have a robust bone marrow transplant program in addition to a big heart transplant program. So those are two prongs you have to have. Yeah. Otherwise, because you cannot do bone marrow transplant one place most of the time, and then heart transplant. It's really a team approach. When to list patient, how to list them, when to resume chemotherapy, when to proceed with bone marrow transplant.
Eric just has a question about heart transplant. What are the concerns for someone like Gene or anyone who's getting a heart transplant as far as just longevity and the heart lasting through a lifetime? Yeah.
Very good question. And if you look at people who survive first year, they have a long longevity, but we do lose between 8 to 10% of patients in first year.
You repeat that again. You lose
nationally.
You lose it.
Yeah,
you lose 8
to 10% of patients nationally die after heart transplant within a year. But if you survive first year, you live about 13 years. So what we look into to see if somebody is eligible for heart transplant, it's really multidisciplinary approach. It's not just doctors coming into nurses and say, "Oh, we need a heart transplant." It's really nursing staff, doctors, social workers, pharmacists, and everyone else meeting in the room and say, "Do we have adequate resources? Do we have adequate support? to have this, once we say a patient needs heart transplant, really it's up to the rest of the team. Our surgeons, Dr. Danter, Zorn, and Downey will say, well, this patient is surgical candidate or not surgical candidate, because some patients might not be surgical candidate. But a lot of drives who does well. Patients who are less sick do better, who have less comorbidities do better. Then, of course, donor factors come into play. How long is your donor, and everything else plays a factor. How long? What is your longevity, and what is your care afterwards, and how do you change things that were bad beforehand after heart transplant?
Right. So it's not one thing. It's a list of things
Yes.
that have to be all in alignment for sure. But getting past that first year is key. That's going to tell us a lot about
Yes.
how long that will have to
Absolutely.
last. So Dr. Shaw, you may have mentioned this earlier, but Terry wants to know again, what symptoms will people feel with amyloidosis? Is there anything they will feel that will then let them know that they need to go see a doctor?
Yes. So generally speaking, if amyloidosis affects the heart, they have heart failure symptoms, which will be shortness of breath first on exertion. Then it will progress to shortness of breath at rest. They will start accumulating fluids. Their legs will be swollen. At some point, they may get short of breath lying down flat and have to get up at night because they cannot breathe, sit on the edge of the bed. Appetite will fall, and they will get full easily even after taking part of their meals. So these are most common symptoms. Then some unique symptoms related to amyloidosis, different types, which are common in all of them, are patients generally can get numbness in the hands, generally both hands. We call it carpal tunnel syndrome. Depending on what amyloid we talk about, they can even get the surgeries in their wrists, generally both sides. They can have lower back pain called lumbar stenosis because of the tightness in the spine. Again, can have numbness, tingling in their feet because nerves will be involved. They can be seeing a nephrologist because kidneys are involved. One important symptom is lightheadedness when they stand up. We call it dysautonomia. They are very dizzy, very lightheaded all the time. I think these are most common symptoms.
Yeah, so you'll know something's wrong. Last question, kind of a fun one from Jeremy. Dr. Vidic, what part of working on the heart do you find most interesting?
Well, helping patients. We're seeing a patient that cannot do anything, and multiple patients we had on show with you, and they're enjoying life. Seeing Gene with his grandkids, seeing Gene with his wife, going out for dinner, and we want them to live life. We don't want them to be in a bed, and that's most rewarding. That's most fulfilling, but also it's most depressing when you see patients don't do well, or they're still struggling, because some patients do struggle even after heart transplant. Sure. Very small number, but they do. So most rewarding is seeing that patient, and it's really when we evaluate patients, we say we are starting to date, and this is a marriage, and we're going to be together for a long time with the heart transplant program, and you have to like us, and we have to like you. Really make sure that we have good relationship, and that's what really drives patients to live longer. And you can see patients who get along with our coordinators, and coordinator relationship with the patient is most important, because it's just like that family member, you want to tell everything, because the more you tell us, better information we have, more information, better decisions we can make. And it's really a relationship, not just, hey, we have provided a service to you today and we're done with you. We really follow them for the rest of their life, and very frequently.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's a dating situation that turns into a lifelong, beautiful marriage and partnership. What do you want folks to take away from our conversation today? What's the big takeaway?
I think from a heart transplant standpoint, and from treatment for all these rare diseases, or more common than we initially thought, are evolving. We are able to provide more support even up front. Earlier diagnosis is very, very important, because earlier diagnosed patients, more treatment options you can provide for them. And then I think all of us are very proud to be here in our transplant program, where we're providing services to patients that we would not have provided years ago, and that's the most fulfilling part.
Thank you for being with us today. Dr. Shaw, what's the takeaway today?
So as Andrea beautifully elaborated, I will also add, this is most for the patient's takeaway is, if you are not satisfied, if you feel something is still wrong, take second opinion, especially from KU, where we have sub expertise in everything. If you are not satisfied, still have symptoms, still think you are not progressing, answers don't make sense, always take second opinion. We are one step away.
Docs, thanks so much for sharing your information with us today. Thanks to all of our viewers and all your great questions. We'll see you back here tomorrow at 8. Coming up tomorrow on the Morning Medical Update. When a cow went through a windshield, it crushed part of Una Kim's skull. Survival wasn't certain, much less a normal life. I'm Jessica Lovell on the next Morning Medical Update, relearning to eat, talk, and even breathe. Friday at 8 a.m.
Subscribe to our Morning Medical Update and Open Mics with Dr. Stein's podcast. Now, everywhere podcasts are available.